Everyone, how's everyone doing? After last night's beer fest. Actually, much perkier look. I assumed much worse. So everyone made the bus and everyone looks somewhat awake, so that's a good thing. But I'm glad to be here. We've got a really full day ahead of us. Can everyone hear me okay with this microphone? Make sure, because it's a big room. Basically what we're going to do today is kind of going through storytelling, from thinking about formulating a story to kind of the different tools we can use, both to capture the story and share the story, and then putting everything together at the end by getting together in groups and working on some short scripts. And then we'll choose one of those scripts at the end to actually film, and I'll go through the whole editing process on screen to give you an idea of how we do something from start to finish, like our 15-second science episodes. So I wanted to bring that up first because when we do that, we'll break up into groups of probably about 5 to 6. I know some of you already work together, so that might be a good group because you all have the same interests. So maybe on the coffee breaks and during lunchtime, if you can find a few folks that are in the same field or have the same interests to work with at the end, that would be great. It's not a necessity, but it might work a little better, because what we'll do is we'll come up with a script of 2 to 3 sentences, kind of the 15-second science style. We'll also come up with a few social media posts that will be related to that and kind of have the complete package. So if you were doing it on your own and planning it on your own, you would have all the pieces you would need to get the video out and promote it and that type of thing. So keep that in mind for the end. And what we'll try to do, I'm hoping if we have time, we'll film one with a larger camera, and I'll film a second one with my iPhone, so we can kind of compare the quality and how you would do it both different ways. So hopefully we'll have time to do both. If not, we'll get at least one done. So that's kind of the whole day. As we go through on the coffee breaks, if you have any questions about anything that we've discussed in the previous section, just let me know. I'm also going to go through a lot of camera equipment in the second part. I have it all up here. I have to stay within this zone right here to stay on camera for the filming part. So I can't move around too much to kind of walk around and show you the cameras. So after we go through that part, if everyone kind of wants to come up and take a look at everything and ask any questions, that would be great, just so you can kind of see everything and get familiar with it. So we're going to get started just talking about storytelling in general and the very basics. What makes a good story? When you're thinking about listening to a story, reading a story, anything from a magazine to a newspaper piece to a good book, what are some of the things you look for in a good story? Anyone? Shout it out. Good. A headline that grabs you. Yeah. Good headline writing is important. Title. Good people, good characters. Pictures, especially these days anymore with so much, especially if you're online. You've got tweets popping up, and you've got stories scrolling past, and you've got a lot of things fighting for your attention. So sometimes it's a strong image that you might see first. So we've got good headlines, good titles, strong characters, good imagery. Anything else? Suspense? That's always a good thing. Emotions, yes, pulling at the heartstrings. Yep, something that you've never heard about, and it's like, oh my goodness, type. And then that's the type of thing that usually you want to share with friends, right? Especially if it's something really intriguing. I know I'm in a room of fellow science nerds, but like facts really get me. Like, did you know this deep sea fish does that? Or did you know there are microbes under the crust, under the surface of the ocean? That type of thing is really exciting. So we've mentioned a few of these things. Something that pulls you in, something that has really interesting characters, something that might resonate with you in your daily life, science, oceans, nature, has a good flow. When you're reading it, you don't get lost. It flows evenly from one step to another. Simple. One of my favorite statements, one of my journalism professors used to say, he was always to the point, but he would say, "Keep it simple, stupid." This was before political correctness, but and he would literally write that on the top. If we got too flowery with our writing and wanted to throw in all these adjectives, it was red X X X X. Keep it simple, and teach something. As we said, everyone likes to learn something. You don't feel like your time is wasted if you've spent 5 minutes watching a video or reading a piece and you come away with a couple new facts. So those are all some things to keep in mind when you're thinking about pulling together a story. So how do you become a good storyteller? You may enjoy stories, but do you ever really stop to think about why you enjoy that story? One of the things that I can't emphasize enough is if you want to become a good storyteller, read, watch, listen, dissect. We've got public radio in the United States, and I know there's BBC radio in the UK and in Europe. And sometimes there are really intriguing stories. On NPR in the US, they call it driveway moments. The stories where you're driving home and you park your car in front of your house, but the story is just so good you sit in your car for the rest of it because you don't want to miss the end and the time it takes you to get in your car to get in the house. And reading everything, poetry, reading nonfiction, reading good fiction, old fiction, new fiction, magazines, long-form journalism, reading a good variety of things and listening to a good variety of things, that sticks in your mind. And if something really resonates with you, just kind of stop and give it a couple extra minutes and look at it and say, okay, why is this really sticking with me? Why am I sitting in the car listening to this? Is it because of the character and where they came from and their history? Is it how they're speaking, how they're telling the story? Is it really good sound effects in the back that kind of bring something to the piece? And really thinking about that kind of gives you that framework when you go to make your own stories. You can build upon that framework. For me, I spend a lot of time in the car. We don't have a great public transport system where I am in the US, which is no surprise. But I listen to lots of audiobooks. Basically, audiobooks and public radio get me from point A to point B because I'm driving so much. And some of the audiobooks, I learned so much. I can put the first disc in, and within the first chapter, I know whether or not I'm going to listen to the whole story because of how good the sound is or how engaging the speaker is. And I think about those things when we're pulling together some video stories for the work I do. When someone starts speaking on camera, I can usually tell whether or not it's going to work within the first couple minutes, and then think about how we can tweak it. If you're interviewing someone on camera and they're not a natural speaker standing in front of the camera staring into it, just think about how they might be more comfortable, how that person might tell a story in their own way, in their own comfort zone. A lot of times we try to stay away from the talking heads in front of a blank screen, because that's not how they usually talk about their work. They're usually in the laboratory talking to colleagues, or in a classroom setting, which might be more comfortable, sitting down rather than standing up. So a lot of times you have to experiment to kind of figure out what works, and always have that ear for how it would sound to others. And you can really do that by listening to the great stuff, by reading the things that really you engage with, and learning from those pieces. Randy Olson is a great science communicator, and he breaks it down along the lines of keep it simple, stupid. Tell simple yet true stories. Kind of break it down to the essence of the story, and don't embellish it. Just kind of get to the truth of the subject. And again, no one will ever complain because you made something too easy to understand. It's the simple truth. You have to think about the general viewer that's watching. If you break it down to the very essence of what you're talking about, then you've got that kernel to work with. And you can always build up from there. You can always get more complex, but it's best to always break it down to the simplest form first. And then you can go from there, especially with scientific topics. We try to keep it at, for us, it's about a middle school level, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, sometimes even a little simpler, because for us, the general population, that's kind of their ceiling, especially for scientific knowledge. So having that simple piece as the cornerstone, and then working from that and perhaps building it up into a more complex piece is always a better way of doing things than getting a very complex recording or a description of something and then figuring out afterwards, how do I make sense out of this? So for an example, if I have someone talking about ocean currents, and I have them simply explain how currents flow from one place to another and kind of the effects on the whole system, is great, rather than having them use the more complex terms like Coriolis effect, or and then having to think about creating a graphic or some sort of visual that will help people make sense out of it at a later date, if that makes sense. Always get it down to the simplest form. So the basics for successful science communication, always start from the point of that your audience knows nothing. That's always the safest part to start from. Again, you're keeping it simple. And you want to think about an engaging hook. We talked about a good story has a good title, a good headline, a good first sentence, something that piques your interest and draws you in. Especially for multimedia and video storytelling, you've got like those first couple of seconds to get somebody intrigued before their attention is somewhere else. Our attention spans, scientifically shown, research has shown, they're shrinking, they're shrinking, they're shrinking. We've got so much information coming at us. You don't have, an hour to draw somebody into a long documentary, unless you're Planet Earth. But, so having that hook for us, for the 15-second science, we found one of the best ways is to start with a did you know? Throwing that fact right out at folks. And most times they're like, oh, no, I didn't. And then they wait that extra 10 seconds to learn more about it. Illustrate, if at all possible, especially with some of the more complex terms. If you can have a basic graphic or some B-roll footage. And when I'm talking about B-roll, I'm just talking about a video clip that shows something without any sound that you can put over a narration. By seeing it while they're hearing about it, it's much easier for folks to make sense out of it, like the seeing is believing adage. That's always important to think about when you're planning as well. If you've got a person talking about something, how can I illustrate this? If they're in the lab and it's part of what they do, make sure you can get a little video clip of it afterwards, or take a few pictures of the process. So you've got that option if you need it. Having those images or a little video, bless you, is also great for when you start thinking about social media planning. Because if you want to tease something that's coming out, if you have a series of videos or a story, having a really strong image and saying, have you ever wondered about this? Or do you know what this is? Putting it out on social media with that simple image or clip gets people's attention, and then they might check back and be intrigued to see. Say, on Friday, we've got this great story coming out about this. Do you know what it is? Do you know how this works? Kind of planning ahead in that aspect is always a good thing when you're thinking about the whole package. And then again, sharing on appropriate channels when we're talking about social media. On the third section, we'll talk more about the different social media channels and kind of how you can use each. But thinking ahead of that when you're planning your story can really help. Having several different aspects of the story that you can break down for social media is always helpful to think about. When you're planning, one of the first things you need to think about is your audience. Who are you trying to reach? Some of us is very general. It's the general public, or it's school-age children that's being used in the classroom. That will really help you kind of concentrate on the basic aspects of the story you're trying to tell. If you're trying to do it to elementary school students, then you might want something that's a little more active, that will get their attention. If it's, for us, we have some retiree groups that come through, and sometimes these groups are called elder hostel. When they come through, usually we've got a more technical bunch that have more world knowledge, and they want to know the facts. They want to know the nitty-gritty. So if we know that's our audience, we're going to be a little more technical in our storytelling. But whichever way you go, you don't want to use jargon. You don't want to use the big words that sound great and we all throw around among colleagues, but it's just confusing. The other thing is what I call the alphabet soup. Throwing around, we've got so many different organizations like NOAA and NASA, and not everybody knows what all those letters mean. So trying to keep those out of the way until you do your credits and have to recognize the people that are funding you. That just adds confusion to it. So keeping the jargon and all the extras out, just again, is keeping it more simple. I have the email thing up here, the little mail symbol, because one of the first things I think about, I love my mother dearly. I should say that first as a disclaimer. But I think about, how would I write this in an email to my mom? She's not a science person, she's an artist, she thinks very differently, but she's always interested in it. So I think if I'm writing an email to my mom explaining about what I learned today or the scientists that I spent the day with, how would I tell her about it? If I called her and I had 5 minutes to talk to her on the phone, how would I break it down for her? And that's always a good starting point for me, is think about a friend who's curious but not science savvy. How would you write it in an email, or how do you explain it in a phone call to them? And that's always kind of a good starting point in keeping it simple, keeping it jargon-free. These are a few quotes that I like to keep in mind because it gets to the point of that. English is better than Latin. You don't exterminate, you kill. You don't salivate, you drool. You don't conflagrate, you burn. Again, you've got these big words that are really nice and descriptive, but if you break it down to the simpler word, it kind of has more punch, more impact. Moses did not say to Pharaoh, the consequence of non-release of one particular subject, ethnic population, could result ultimately in some kind of algal manifestation in the main river basin with unforeseen outcomes for flora and fauna, not excluding consumer services. I mean, that's jargon. You can make sense out of it, but it's a mouthful, and you really have to stop and think through it, rather than the waters which are in the river shall be turned to blood, and the fish that is in the river shall die, and the river shall stink. You get that much quicker, right? You don't have to stop and think about it. You've got your water, you've got your river, you've got your fish, you've got death, you've got stench. I mean, breaking it down to the simplest aspect is always the best when it comes to really kind of getting that story out. One of the best ways to see if you might be a little too complex or you might be too jargon rich are there are a few different tests. And these presentations are going to be available to you afterwards. So I also have a document that has links to all these, so you don't have to worry about writing down a lot of URLs. So those resources will all be provided. One of the first ones, the Flesch Kincaid grade level. Is anyone use that? Yeah. There's a built-in plugin in Word. If you use Word as your main way of writing, main program, you can actually check your test against this record, and it can show you approximately what grade level it's at. So when we're looking to try to keep it middle grade level, it's a quick, easy way to kind of look at what we have and see what grade level it's at. There's also a couple of sites where you can just copy and paste your text into. Readabilityscore.com is one. And has anyone used the Upgoer 5 text editor? Let me bring that up real quick. I was going to bring that up before. For English, I think it's Splasho. What this does is it compares your text to the 1,000 most used words. Notice it doesn't say 1,000 because 1,000 is not one of the most used words. So it's a way to copy and paste your text into there and to see if you're using some of the most commonly used words in the English language. If we put in that Moses text, sorry, I'm not on my own. It's not going to let me copy from here. Someone just give me a sentence, a simple sentence about something that you do for me to type in.
Communicate C might seem to be simple.
Sorry, communication.
Science is on. That's a bit more complicated. Communicate C.
Communicate.
The C.
Ah.
The C.
Communicating the C?
The C might seem simple.
Sorry, this mouse is.
Might be simple, but it's when science is on. It's a bit more complicated.
So right there, it shows. It shows exactly the non-permitted words. I mean, you're not going to take this as gospel, but it helps you see what words that we might think are very common in the English language aren't in the top 1,000. So it's just another tool to try to you can put your text in and see kind of the red flags or what words you may need to simplify. I believe, if I remember correctly, fish isn't even in there. Yeah. So it's one of those fun things. If you try to break it down so your sentence would fit within here, it wouldn't make much sense, or it would be so simple, it would be preschool level. But again, it's a good tool to just kind of get an idea of where your text is and where you might have some problematic words on the jargon side.
Does it give you alternatives, like, or do you have to guess what words are the 1000?
Yeah, I mean, you could test it, but it doesn't give you replacements. It's just kind of a quick copy paste, and then you kind of have your red blotches throughout, and you can scan through and say, okay, this might be a little too jargony, or this might be too up there. But if you see fish, obviously you can use fish.
I'm sorry, but how were these 1,000 words, from where does they come? Because if they come from a common language, you can write a burger, Coke, and it will be the text. complex, but it's not useful for us.
For non-English, you mean? I'm sorry?
I'm just wondering from where does come these 1,000 words?
It's just from research on the most commonly used words in the English language. So it's non-scientific, it's not science-based. It's just a very simple, basic tool that I use sometimes just to kind of paste in there to see where I might have issues. I don't take it as gospel. Like I say, I still use the word fish, but it's just kind of a quick, because sometimes we get caught up in our own work and our own kind of sphere of communicating with each other. And I just use it kind of to bounce some text off of and kind of get a clear look at it to see if all of a sudden every third or fourth word is highlighted, then I might be getting a little too complex. So in planning this story, basically, before you even get started, you really need to concentrate on what is the story that you're trying to tell. For most of us, we're trying to highlight some research or work that's being done, or maybe a finding that just happened. But to write that down kind of in a basic thought, I like to think of it as a headline. If I'm putting this story out here, what would be the headline I'd be writing? What's the kind of back to the very simple kernel of what is it I'm trying to get across? Because having that focus from the very beginning really helps you in planning, rather than getting very general and say, I want to put something out about ocean acidification, and then going into it with a really wide viewpoint. So if you're thinking about particular work you're doing, maybe you can pinpoint a couple different things that you want to highlight. That might be different stops in the story, or might be different stories altogether. Or think about maybe a series, if it's a piece of research that's ongoing. What are some stories you can tell along the process, from the very start of the research to what they're finding as they can go along to the ending? And having that framework and really kind of thinking about the main point you're trying to get across when you start out is key. Getting very into that, again, that kernel, rather than going into it very wide-ranging and being able to kind of see it going anywhere, is where you kind of get into trouble, especially when you're thinking about video. If you've got an event and you're going out and you're thinking, oh, I'm just going to cover everything, and then you run around and you get a little bit of everything, but none of it's really usable because it's not cohesive. It doesn't have that flow. So even taking five minutes before an event, or talking to someone about their research and identifying that headline that you want to write will really help you focus kind of in on the main idea. Oops. I was talking about being in our spheres and our bubbles. It helps to step out of that kind of internal view of our organizations to think about how you can bring these stories out to be of interest of everybody else. When you're in a room full of fellow scientists or fellow communicators, you all get excited about the same thing, but if you're thinking about you're wanting to engage your audience, whether it be the public or school students, think about their viewpoint and step out of your own shoes and your own sphere and into theirs, and think about what will engage with them, what might they find most interesting about it. Because if you don't find that engagement, if you don't find that hook to bring them in, you're not going to have them as an audience. So where's that opportunity to connect? And sometimes it helps if you're planning something ahead of time to actually talk to some of those audience members and say, hey, what interests you most about this? On social media, there's several easy ways to take simple polls of your audience. On Twitter, you can do a little poll in your Twitter feed. On Facebook, you can put a little poll on your Facebook page where you can ask some questions about what interests you or what would you like to learn more about in this topic. And sometimes those ideas might flash something that you haven't thought of before. For us with the 15-second science, now that we've been doing it for a year, we get a lot of people commenting on some of the videos and say, hey, that was really cool, or the teacher will say, this was great, I was able to use it in a classroom. And we always try to engage back and say, oh, that's so great to hear, glad you were able to find it useful. What else would you find useful? What other subjects would you like to see us highlight? What have you always wondered about? And that often leads to some interesting kind of avenues that we hadn't considered before. In Delaware Sea Grant, one of the things we do is focus areas is coastal processes. So basically how the ocean affects the beach and how storms come in and change beaches and change the landscape. Well, that also can affect beach safety. And that was something that our audience is basically the general public. We're science serving the Delaware coast. So we're serving all of the public. And people were wondering, they're like, that's great about the flooding and the information about how the beach changes, but what about my safety when I visit the beach? And that actually turned into a series of guest 15-second science by local lifeguards. We had several of the lifeguard crew in the summertime do little 15-second science on safety at the beach with their family. And then one of our researchers came in and did one on the power of waves. And that actually was shared more widely than some of our other things because it was useful information, it was pertinent to what we did, and it never hurts to have some lifeguards in bathing suits on our 15-second science. Pro tip, if you ever have to mic a lifeguard, have them put their whistle on. It's the only place that you can clip a microphone. I learned that the hard way. So then you find some other challenges there too, but you also have some learning opportunities and you have some vehicles there. The lifeguard associations were also able to share our pieces out to the public on their social media as well, so it kind of snowballed with our sharing it and connecting back to some of our science, but then the lifeguards also sharing it to their audience, and then folks sharing it with each other because they're planning their vacation to the beach. The Tourism Bureau shared it. Hey, you come into the beach this weekend, check out this playlist to keep your family safe. So really engaging with your audience and knowing your audience and asking them for feedback and asking them what kind of stories they'd like to hear can be huge, because a lot of times you'll get answers that no one in your sphere or bubble or office may have thought of because you're focused, especially with a lot of the scientific research, and some of the researchers we have are absolutely brilliant, but they're really hyper-focused on their topic and their area, and they're total experts in that area, but sometimes they don't think kind of more widely out of that, or how their work might impact the general public and folks around them. And with a lot of the scientific funding these days, especially in the US, a lot of the research funding has an education and outreach component written in now. So it's not just plain money going towards the research. They have to write in this education and outreach component to the research grants to help inform the public about where the tax dollars are going. So they're doing this, really specific research, but how does that, how will it impact or how will it help the normal taxpayer? And in a lot of our work, we're using those funds in that education outreach section to do some of these pieces and get the word out to fulfill that component of the grants. So that can also be a great source if you're looking for funding to do more of this stuff, talking to some of the researchers that are getting these grants and these monies, a lot of them do not want to do that part of the grant and are looking to hire folks to take care of that portion because they're not comfortable with it. So it's another great outlet.
It's of course very important to know your audience, but sometimes, especially with social media, you don't know who is
And that's
your audience. I mean, you have many different categories in that.
And it is, and for us it's very broad, but every one of the social media platforms that are out there have very good analytics that are getting better and better and better. They keep improving them. So any content that you put out there, you can go back and look at, basically you can drill down into the demographics. You can see age groups, you can see geographical areas where the content was popular. The swimming scallops, little 15-second science I showed, that it was very popular, but our largest audience was in Canada. We're not sure why, but you can actually see that in these, in Instagram, in Twitter, in Facebook, in YouTube, in all of those, you can get this real-time feedback. And as you go, if something's really popular, you can look into it and say, okay, who's looking at this? Where are they coming from? You can also see how they share it. If something totally falls flat, you can kind of look at it and see, okay, maybe the time of day was different. If we have something that totally falls flat and we're not sure why it didn't work on social media, sometimes we'll share it in a different way, on a different time, on a different day. And you can look at bigger trends as well on social to see kind of when your users are more active. And that's what in the experimenting. Just keep trying different things, seeing what works. And when something really works or really resonate, really dig into that those analytics and try to piece together why. And you can also ask people, hey, did you enjoy this latest episode, or if you enjoyed this video, can you leave a comment why? And kind of gather that information too. The greatest thing about social media is the social aspect, and you're really able to reach out and engage with the people that are sharing it and viewing it. And sometimes we get audiences, we put out a scientific bulletin on Phragmites, which is an invasive reed in our marshes, and it kind of blew up, and it was a pretty technical piece. And we found out, looking at it, that local fire departments had shared it because they do prescribed burns in the area to take out the weed, and people always ask questions about why are they setting the marsh on fire. So by looking at who shared it out and kind of that flashpoint on the social of why it really kind of went huge, we then saw that there was this public curiosity about what the fire department was doing. So we were actually able to do some other simpler pieces about why this is a problem, why it takes away habitat from native plants and wildlife. And that's why the fire department is out there setting the marsh on fire. So social can be a great way in kind of unraveling those mysteries. It just takes a little legwork and curiosity. And Google Analytics is another great tool. If you're putting blogs on your website, if you're putting a lot of content on your website, you can also look page by page, and you can see what PDFs are downloaded and kind of breaking down the analytics in that. So the data is all there, and they're making it easier and easier to kind of sort through. You used to really have to kind of dig through, but they're making it more graphic. They're giving you lovely graphs. They're giving you maps where they're highlighting, the areas where it's really popular. And even Instagram is doing that now. If you're on Instagram, do many people use Instagram as your institution? You do? Just make sure that when you sign up on Instagram, that you mark it as a business account. And then they give you analytics right within the app as well. If you're a personal account, it doesn't have it, but if you mark it as a non-personal account, you can see actually with each post kind of all of that information as well. That used to be the one kind of blank spot where you're flying blind, but they fixed that. Whoops. And then next, just want to say there's no such thing as boring knowledge, only a boring presentation. This isn't 100% true, but it's a quote I like to keep in mind, just especially when I'm thinking about a really complex subject, is, okay, this might, if you hear about it, you might think it's really boring, but how can I make it interesting? How can I flip it around and make it a topic that somebody wants to learn more about? So it's just a good quote to keep in the back of your mind when you're thinking about planning. And basically, especially with videos, have 3 goals, really simple goals to keep in mind. Be interesting, be useful, and be short. That's it in a nutshell. Be engaging from the start, hook folks in, give them something that's useful, something that they either want to learn more about or they want to share with others or they can use in their everyday life. And again, keep it simple, keep it nice and short. It's better to do several short pieces that can be linked together than to try to fit a whole bunch of things into one video. Especially with social media, it's much easier to share the short pieces than try to make something more complex. So you've got this headline, you've got this kernel of idea for your story. So next step is thinking about how are you going to engage, how are you going to hook, how are you going to pull people into the story. Your once upon a time. Opening lines, does anyone have any favorite opening lines of a book or an article? I put some classic ones up there. It was a dark and stormy night. We all know the last one, Moby Dick. Very simple, engaging. No one has a favorite first line from literature? Yeah.
I don't remember the name of the girl in the book, but it was the day that she decided to die. And I thought, oh, okay. So what happens after?
Exactly. Very simple. And you're like, oh, I need to know more about this. That simple, that punch, that hook. I pulled a couple opening lines from pieces that I recently read. If you lean over the side of the boat and scoop up some water of a jug, you've just taken a census of the ocean. That was the opening line of a recent story in the Atlantic that Ed wrote. And he was talking about how they literally pulled DNA out of these samples to get an idea of what lives in a certain region. But I'm envisioning I can just take a scoop out and I can learn about, take a census of the ocean. The other one, these days, Paul, the director of Gotham Whale, often finds himself bobbing on the waters off Brooklyn trying to record the sound of flatulent fish. So I read that, I'm like, why are the fish farting and why does he want to know? Those types of things. There's also one on whale snot recently I read, and as soon as I read it, it was actually about teenagers that were helping with the citizen science project, and they built a better robot to collect whale snot. But the first sentence was on the whale snot. I'm like, I didn't know whales had snot. So just think about kind of those opening lines. What's an aspect of the science that you can really get people thinking about? Someone might be taking these sound recordings that are of these flatulent fish. They're doing something much more technical, but if you can link it back to something that people can relate to, flatulence, we all do it. It's like that book, Everybody Poops. Then they're like, oh, I know what that is, but I didn't know fish farted. Thinking about that kind of bring it back down to that middle school level. it is a great way in kind of writing out the first lines, the did you knows, to get that hook straight in your mind, because then that will help you kind of build the rest of it behind it. So this is one example of a video I saw recently that started, I thought, with a very interesting opening and turned it out to be on a piece that I totally did not expect. So I'm going to play this one for you. Is all the sound okay? Okay. To give you an idea of a video on a scientific topic that really uses character to draw you in. Is that better?
Have you ever wondered if you watched the snow long enough, what stories it might tell? There is someone who has done it. His name is Billy Barr.
I spell it small b-I-L-L-Y, small b-A-R-R.
Some people call him the Snow Guardian. He lives in a cabin out in the woods.
Picture this. It's a snowy day, it's dark and cold, and you make a fire, and you're sitting by the fire, and you're reading with a cup of tea, and it goes on for 9 months.
Billy lives alone in this house he helped build. Here he grows his garden, has an impressive hat collection, loves cricket, and dreams of Bollywood. Every couple of weeks, he skis back into the nearest town for supplies. He's been doing this for more than 40 winters. But Billy does a little more than just read and drink tea. For those 40 winters, Billy has kept a meticulous record of snow in his little part of the world.
Okay, Rocket said February 26, 1978, 10.5 inches of snow that day. January 20th, minus 11.5. April 28th, 1980, high was 41. Damn it. 1997, 1/2 inch new snow. A weasel was roaming around inside the shack. Damn, the birds were back. I lived in an 8 by 10 foot old shack. It had no electricity, no water, and I had nothing, I was just there all day. The main thing I interacted with was the weather and the animals. So I started recording things just because there was something to do. I had nothing to prove, no goals, no anything. So actually a researcher at the lab wanted to look at it. And then once he started looking at it scientifically, then all of a sudden, like, these decades worth of data were being used for more than my own curiosity.
Billy has done this every day, twice a day, all winter long.
I'd keep going until the snow was gone. If it snowed, I would record that no matter when. The trend I see is that we're getting a permanent snowpack later, and we get to bare ground sooner. We'll have years where there was a lot of snow on the ground, and then we lost snow sooner than years that had a lot less snow, just because it's a lot warmer now.
In a normal winter, you'd expect to have 4 to 5 record high temperatures. Last year, Billy recorded 36.
Not only is it a lot warmer, we're getting a lot of dust blowing in. As soon as you get dust on the snow, it melts like that. You're talking about the snowpack, the water supply for most of the Southwest. I'm not real hopeful just because I don't know how you reverse something like that.
As we leave Colorado behind, Billy imparts one last bit of advice.
It's like anything else. I learned to ski to get around. I learned how to ski better so I wouldn't fall down all the time. Over a period of time, I kind of learned how to survive in this environment. Actually, learning to fall is probably the most important thing. You're going to fall sick. A lot easier falling on your butt than on your face.
So that was a clip where you're interested in character. Billy came on and you're like, who is this guy and what is he doing? And he's got his different hats. And it was a story about him and what he's done, but it also talked about the data and it also talked about climate. And it used that character to try to pull everything together, but use that character as a hook to pull you in because you wanted to learn more about him. And you wanted to learn more about kind of the snow and the environment that he's in. A friend of mine pulled that together. When I saw it, it was one of those examples of, read and watch as much as you can. And he shared it on social media and I watched it and I had a light bulb moment. Is that we've got these great characters in our, we've got a water quality citizen science program where we have volunteers go out in local waterways and collect data for us. And we've got some really interesting people doing that, but we've focused more on the data and the reports and everything coming out of it. We really haven't focused on the people. So we started, when they came in, we started just doing short recordings of who they are, where they live, and why they do it. And we got some of the best little quotes and blurbs out of them. We had one lady who originally had no interest whatsoever, but her husband was very interested and very into, he was a retired engineer, very technical. And she said she started going out to help him. She said, I started going out to help wipe his water bottles. But then I saw a dolphin go by and then there were herons flying. And she describes this beautiful scene of where she's taken these water samples. And it was some of the most kind of sincere quotes. And you saw this impact of a person who really got interested in the science due to her just being out there in the environment. So we're able to pull those quotes and those little mini stories together. We could share the kind of the blurbs, like her talking about the heron on social media, linking back to our water quality and say, are you interested in being part of this too? And we could also bring all the pieces together into a longer story about our water quality program. And then we ended up having a 20th anniversary of the program. And we had all these little pieces that we could put together into a longer anniversary piece that the university could use. So sometimes some of these personal stories and blurbs, they're great for kind of pulling in the human interest side. They're great for social media and that you can draw people in to be more interested about the program. And then it can also be used later if someone's doing a longer, more in-depth piece. So that story just made me think about kind of the individual people and characters.
So how do you go about, do you always ask them for written consent as you do it? Because I can imagine that's something very important.
It is important. As part of the Creek Watchers program, they do sign a release because sometimes we photograph them when they're doing their work just for archival purposes. When we do things at public events, I have a very basic form I always carry with me and explain what we're doing and how it might be used, and then always give them the option. If someone's at a public event, at least in the U.S. and U.S. law, they're at a public event doing something, I can film them, like at a touch tank or talking to a scientist, and I can use that as B-roll. But for anything where we're doing a targeted interview and we're focusing on them, we make sure to get a release and get permission and make sure they understand how it's being used. I have not had anybody say no yet, especially Sometimes if they're not sure about it because of having my phone on me at all times, I can bring up a YouTube clip and say, yep, this is what it's going to look like. This is an example of what we do, and show them right there. And then particularly what we're most careful with is children. Anyone under 18, we make sure we've got at least one parent or guardian that can sign off for them and is okay with it, because people are very sensitive about children being on camera, and particularly social media. So if we're doing school events, we will put releases out to the teachers at least a week ahead of time for students to take in. If there's any sort of concern about children's faces, shoot so you can't see, so no one's recognizable. I think I've got an example a little bit later on where we didn't have releases, and I was shooting just their hands doing things, or from the back of the room where you could see the hands shooting up, but you can't recognize any of the children. So there's always ways to work around it. You know, feet moving, hands doing something from the back. Once we didn't have releases, and we had something really cool going on, and luckily it was winter, and all the children showed up with hats and hoods on. Yes, because I could get that footage without putting any children in jeopardy of being recognized. So a few more examples of thinking about how you visualize a story, keeping the adage, seeing is believing. Having kind of the actual thing that you're talking about on screen is always helpful. And thinking about how you can show your topic creatively is always a bonus. I'm going to talk about some of the equipment that we have available now very inexpensively. You can get a little more creative, especially with like the GoPro cameras that are waterproof. You can actually dunk them into the tanks and give a different view. And sometimes you have something going on that is really visually interesting that you know is going to happen, and you can actually formulate a story around. And I'm going to show an example of that real quick too. But because a video, like photography and design, is about using the images to convey a message. Every image that you put up there should help further the story or help engage people into the story. So what we call storyboarding, or planning out kind of the images that go with each piece of the story, is a very important part. You've probably seen it on like behind the scenes making of animations like Disney movies, where they have a room full of sketches and writing next to it. Kind of the back of the napkin planning is just kind of, you don't even have to sketch out the shot, but just writing the shot next to what someone might be saying to kind of give that, give yourself a visual plan is always helpful going into it. Before you start shooting, having that shot list, saying, okay, I want to make sure I show the scientists with the equipment, I want to show the sample being taken, I want to show the computer screen that shows the analysis, and knowing you want those different shots is always much more useful beforehand. Going into it, then getting into the editing process and getting to a point where you think, oh, I really should have got the computer screen that showed the graph. So trying to think ahead and think of all those things is very useful. I try to give myself time if I know I'm interviewing somebody about their work. I try to make the shot list beforehand from the research I've done beforehand. But then when I'm interviewing and talking to the person, I'm also keeping it in the back of my mind if they say something I don't expect, to kind of jot that down to make sure I get that B-roll right afterwards while I'm still there. If they explain a process I wasn't aware of, or point out a machine that looks really cool, and you know, some things just look really sciencey and they look good on the screen, and he said, I use that, I'm like, great. Then I'll set up the camera and get a shot of that because I might be able to use it. So I've got two examples now, one where there's something really interesting and visually stunning going on that they've done the story around. And then the second one is a topic that's really kind of complex and hard to show. And they did a very creative way of drawing people in to kind of wonder more about this topic. So I'll do the visually stunning one first.
Black rhino and rhinos generally are under huge pressure. We really have to fight for them. If they don't have champions, they're doomed to disappear. This is the kindest way we've yet discovered of moving a rhino from the field to a vehicle.
It is a big operation. It's a lot of animals to try and move in a really short time.
There are no roads. There is no access whatsoever. You know, most of these parks are wilderness area.
The WWF Black Rhino Range Expansion Project aims to boost the growth rate of the black rhino populations of South Africa.
It's become a passion. It's not just a job, it's a passion, and yeah, it gets into your soul.
There hasn't really been an operation of this nature with 20 black rhino conducted in South Africa.
It's a bit sad to let them go. You get attached to them. The field rangers know them by name.
Every single one is different. You know, it's a wild animal. It's completely unpredictable.
We're really glad for them because we think it's we know that it's critical and it's extremely important for us.
Over 1,400-kilometer journey. It's the longest journey I've ever done with rhinos.
The black rhino coming back in this area is a very big thing.
This has been a very good cooperative thing because we've got Eastern Cape parks, we've got sand parks, we've got Disemvelo KZN Wildlife, and of course WWF.
And I think it could only work because all the different parties are so passionate.
It's a huge thing to see them for the first time come to this particular area here.
It stops here for us, but for them it's now a lifetime commitment that they have to keep up.
I think it's a great honor for them to be able to have these rhino. These are very special rhino.
There's no doubt that this project has made a huge difference to rhino conservation in South Africa.
So that's an example of something that's happening within the project that is absolutely visually stunning. You just can't take your eye off of a rhino flying through the air. And when I saw it, the first thing I'm thinking about, oh my God, social media, this would be so much fun. Have you ever seen a rhinoceros fly? You know, those type of hooks are great when you've got this type of imagery. So if you've got something really cool coming up, something that doesn't happen very often or something that people may not see in their lifetime, think about capturing that and then how you can use that kind of as the kernel of your story to kind of get the story about your wider project out. So that video story, it talked about community partnerships, it talked about rhino conservation, it showed kind of the human and interaction with the wildlife, and you could feel that they truly cared about these animals. And it showed the whole process of how they do this. And you see the rhino's okay at the end, even though it's hanging upside down thousands of feet above the air. So it's a very short video, but it gets a lot of messages across, and it really draws you in by that kind of one special thing that you'll probably never see in your lifetime. So think about some of those opportunities. For us, we had a large wind turbine go up on campus. And it happened pretty quickly, and we're able to kind of do a time lapse and bring people into the process, but at the same time talk about why it's going up and some of the research that we're doing around alternative energy. So think about those kind of visual hooks as well. Now this one takes a very broad, kind of complex topic, which may be hard to think about how you can really visualize, and does it very creatively. Has anyone seen Mr. W? No? Okay. I'm not going to give anything away, I'm just going to play it.
I think I was always misunderstood. People just didn't seem to like me. I think I annoyed them. I got on their nerves. I don't know why. That's just the way it was. Yeah. Maybe I was too intense. Maybe I came on too strong. I don't know. I really can't say. Yeah, it was lonely. Really lonely. But you get used to it after a while. And then, one day, everything changed. Somebody finally accepted me for what I am. Since I've got this job, life is completely different. I finally feel useful, good at something.
So if you're thinking about wind and you're thinking about wind energy, that's kind of a complex thing to get across and kind of capture. But first time I saw this, I'm like, what? This guy's a jerk. What is he doing? And then I started seeing, the visual cues behind the little turbine. There's a turbine picture, and you start putting it together, and then you're like, oh. So it's just an example of a really creative way to kind of think outside the box for some of these really broader topics. Something that would work really well on social media to kind of pull people into your alternative energy or your wind project. So that's just a very different way of doing it. So I think that brings us in just a couple minutes over into the coffee break. Through kind of the basics of thinking about formulating these stories and some examples. Does anyone have any quick questions before the break? And then we'll kind of go into the imagery right after. No? All right.